In 2019, humanity received a warning. 30 of the world's leading scientists released the results of a massive 3-year study into global agriculture and declared that meat production is destroying our planet and jeopardizing global health. One of the study's authors explained that humanity now poses a threat to the stability of the planet. This requires nothing less than a new global agricultural revolution.
That was Bruce Frederick in 2019 talking about the need for a food revolution. Bruce Frederick is the founder and CEO of the Good Food Institute. We have with us a representative from the Good Food Institute, Chris Kraus, who heads up operations in Japan. Chris agreed to talk to us about his role at the GFI and the GFI's role in the food revolution for this TQ podcast on the future of food. Hello, Chris. It's great to have you here, and thanks for joining me on this podcast. Please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work.
So I'm based in Japan. Good Food Institute originally launched in the US. And they're a nonprofit, fully philanthropically funded, focusing 100% on alternative proteins and the acceleration of alternative proteins, and doing so from a policy perspective, from a direct research perspective, and from an industry acceleration perspective. So kind of, working on it from all fronts. And alternative proteins, as you may or may not know, that kind of speaks the three categories that GFI, Good Food Institute, kind of breaks it down into, and most of the food world breaks it down into, are plant-based proteins, and which you'll know of. For example, Beyond Meat, Impossible Burger, Loads and loads of different companies around the world launching plant-based, and then another pillar being fermentation-based. So that's actually taking strains, bacterias, mycoprotein, and using fermentation technology to kind of create proteins from what was originally just a small strain. And sometimes, if I understand correctly, sometimes the fermentation and the plant-based technologies can be kind of combined actually to create a final product, all with the name of getting the best taste and texture possible. And then the third kind of group and pillar is cultivated meat. So that's, coming directly from cell lines. So it's basically taking the cell of an animal, say, for example, cell of chicken breast, and then kind of growing it in a lab, and kind of mimicking the process that happens in nature, like when a chicken is naturally growing, or a cow, or whatever it might be, but growing just the individual organ there, or parts, and then getting it to the final stage where it's actually consumable. And some people are a little bit shocked or curious when they hear that answer, and I was too the first time I heard about this, kind of like, whoa. That's when we kind of when we compare that to modern animal agriculture and all the inputs that are going into to animals, and the agricultural land being used, and the massive amount of antibiotics being pumped into animals, and the treatment of animals, then it's actually ends up being a much cleaner, potentially safer, and tastier, maybe healthier alternative if we can get it, the technology there. So those are the three. Sorry to kind of go on a tangent, but those are the.
And do you think there's going to be a bit of a race between those three different methods, or do you think they're all going to kind of grow alongside each other? And
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what we're seeing now is they're all important. I mean, still all of alternative proteins is making up a pretty small share of protein consumption worldwide.
Yeah,
And what we're starting to see are companies that are combining, for example, like a really they've come up with this formulation that's a really tasty plant-based protein, and they might combine it with actually you can do the same thing in terms of cultivated.
yeah,
You can do like cultivated fat. So maybe they're using like a bit of cultivated fat cell, combining that with like a plant-based protein, say let make a burger, for example. So you'd have a burger which was like part constructed from plants and then part constructed from actual fat cells, and it would be a bit mixing those technologies. And the feedback I've heard from people who have tasted some of those products is those like it mimics the real taste of meat
yeah.
almost to a T.
Have you tasted any products, any cultivated meat products?
I never have.
No.
I have not. I'd like to. So currently, the only place they're available in the world is Singapore.
Right.
So they're actually on the market in Singapore in one or two outlets, not many places, but it's a Good Meat Company out of San Fran who got the regulation for that, and the FDA in the U.S. recently passed regulation to allow a cultivated meat company there to well they passed like a really large safety measure. I think in the US it still does have another round, maybe two to pass, but basically this company passed very, very rigorous safety tests and inspections from the FDA, which was like quite a long process. So that's kind of a good
Yeah.
sign of it moving forward. But yeah, so Singapore is in many ways leading the way in terms of this, in terms of like policy makers really getting on board and kind of encouraging this.
Yeah.
But we expect to see it happening in other countries, and there's certainly a lot of investment in R&D being done in it.
I also heard that one of the reasons that they are mixing plant-based and cultivated meat is for price, is for cost, so they can keep the cost down, because if they had a pure kind of cultivated meat burger, it's still going to be out of the reach of the normal consumer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So currently at the stage it's at now, yeah, as you can imagine, bringing a fully cultivated product all the way to shelf to consumer is still quite pricey. I mean, all the hoops to jump through, and even, yeah, getting the taste, texture, everything, while it's largely there,
Yeah.
still is not yet reaching like price parity with traditional animal agriculture. So yeah, definitely that's another way to maybe bring the price down and make it
Yeah.
accessible to consumers.
I've seen that it's sort of mainly sort of San Francisco, Israel, and Singapore, and the Netherlands that are the big hitters in this space.
And Brazil, there's a good amount of interest, and Brazil, home to some of the home to a lot of like some of the larger meat companies and meat production companies. So I think there's potential to kind of like disrupt that, or maybe work with
Okay.
some of those larger companies to transition protein supply.
I put the question to friends of mine, if they had a burger that was completely kind of cultured, and they had a burger that had come from a slaughtered animal, but they looked and they tasted and they smelt exactly the same. Which of those two would they choose to eat? And they both told me that they'd rather the slaughtered animal than the than the other one, which really shocked me. It surprised me. How do you find that the kind of taking up of this new idea is going?
Yeah, actually, I guess to speak to that point, it's actually when I've mentioned it to like my friends and family members who are closer to my age, and kind of I explained just a sentence or two about the why behind it.
Mm.
They actually aren't so put off by the idea. They all said they'd be curious to try it and kind of
Okay.
understand the reasons why. I think it's more so when kind of reading some of the comments and reactions that I've read like online from people underneath an article, for example, or certain people who are kind of higher up in the food world who don't like it, don't like the sound of it, and they kind of speak out strongly against it.
Yeah.
Uh, and but yeah, to be honest, the people I've asked, they're all kind of like their ears perk up a bit and they're kind of like curious about it. And
Okay. And what do you think the average person is going to think about this kind of change?
do you mean in terms of cultivated meat or all
Cultivated
alternative?
meat. I think cultivated meat is the one that is really going to create problems. I mean, I see plant-based has been around for a while, and sort of fermentation-based food has been around for a while. You know, if you think of sort of tofu and all of
Yeah. Yeah, I think it will remain a problem for some people based on kind of what you're saying, that we do get in habits and in routines and potentially ruts when it comes to what we're eating and consuming. I think we're all we all can be a bit like that. But I also think amongst this generation and in certain places, including Japan, people are very food curious and kind of want to and are excited to try something new. So if you can combine that food curiosity with a bit of like ethical, principled decision making, and I think there's a lot of that amongst I think Japan in general on a certain level, but especially when it comes to like climate change and sustainability amongst
yeah,
the younger generation in Japan. I think when those two forces combine, then like tradition and routine is going to be surpassed, and kind of overcome. And if it's in order to like catch on anywhere mainstream, well, in Japan and elsewhere, it needs to, you know, taste the same or better or cost the same or less. That's kind of the what some folks at GFI say a lot as the kind of benchmark for what we're aiming for. And I agree with that. The Japanese consumer is quite concerned with taste, cost, and nutrition.
yeah.
And that will be the case.
That a lot of it is going to be part of kind of frozen chicken nuggets and frozen foods, which people won't necessarily know that the meat that's there is lab grown rather than from actual factory farming or something like that. I mean, if you're prepared to eat meat from that's been factory farmed, then perhaps you don't really care where your meat comes from.
Right now, how many of us know, the hundreds of ingredients that are in our pantries in different boxes or packages of food, and how many of us, this is not this is just to say how the nature of food is, amongst the, I guess, developed or hyper developed world, where
Yeah.
we don't really know the main source or all the materials or ingredients of our food. I'm not saying this is an excuse.
Yeah.
I'm not excusing it this way. I think we should go closer to the source of our food. And it's not a good thing to be disconnected from where our food comes from. But I don't think it's a large leap from buying something in a package today, including meat, and not knowing much about the provenance of that meat,
Right.
and then buying, for example, like a packaged meat, like cultivated meat that was grown safely, and with a lot of precautions taken in a lab that might be, appear, taste, and cook better. I don't think it's such a large leap, although it's like the process of getting there is of course quite different. But yeah, I'm not too sure how it will look. And I don't think it will be hidden. I think, bodies like the FDA and like
And what do you think the hurdles are going to be?
there will likely be like pushback from the vested interests in animal agriculture, but at the same time, I think GFI, for example, does a good job of speaking with and working with and doing some joint research and collaboration with some of the larger like animal ag companies to not just pin an us against them story, situation, narrative, but to actually kind of like, I think some of the animal ag companies, they just want to provide and sell a clean source of protein to people. And some of them at the higher levels aren't as attached to, how that protein gets delivered from point A to B to C to the final consumer. The way that factory farming is happening now, does need to change. And whether you think that change should come through more alternative protein options or through something like regenerative farming and more kind of grass-fed animals, there are a lot of interesting, smart, good people working on that side of the spectrum as well. And I'm speaking kind of independently now, not with the GFI hat on, but I think the more that side of things can kind of grow along with the alternative protein side. I don't think we need to like pin one against the other as some leaders in the space kind of do. I think like both the regenerative farm and ag movement need to grow, and that sometimes involves animals.
And so is this part of the work of the Good Food Institute then to kind of bridge that gap between the agricultural industry and the kind of new sort of biotech?
Yeah, I think yes, in a sense. Although, animal derived proteins are certainly never a part of the mission and the acceleration that GFI is pushing for. But GFI is not excluding those larger animal ag companies from the conversation. So it's not a finger pointing battle. It's because we realize, they're the ones that kind of do hold the market and hold the power at the moment. And it's to make like real change on a global scale, in the time frame that we need to make it and clean up sources of protein globally. Speaking with and having them at the table and transitioning, I think their business models and raw materials and all of that is a huge part of it.
You see that the eating habits have changed between, say, your parents' generation and your own?
Our economy has gotten stronger, and it's then food has kind of gone from something that we kind of spent a lot of time and energy and resources on, to something which is kind of more almost interest, hobby, or at times, of course, just necessity. But I think there's a book that comes to mind. I haven't read it yet, but I've like read about it and following the author, and it's by Eve Turow Paul, and she wrote a book called Hungry. What's this subtitle? I'm forgetting, but it's about like this generation's relationship to food and kind of like influencer culture and obsession with something like avocado toast, and kind of like how we're also using that to build community and connection. And so I see a lot of people of my generation and younger, for example, with a revived interest in food and a curiosity around food. And I think that is a good thing. And I think that should be harnessed to, I think along with that, some of the interesting restaurateurs, food voices, et cetera, are just, kind of like doing it for tasty or interesting food. But many of them are also quite connected to where the food's coming from, how it's being made, how it's being produced, the story behind it. I think everyone who I know more or less would be into the story of like a farm to table restaurant and the reasons behind it, and going to visit a farm and cooking some of their own food. I think it's like a pretty well respected thing to do, to be close to your food amongst my generation, for sure. And I think that's a very good thing. And I go back and forth a bit between, well, you can have both, but I think during the pandemic as well, there were kind of a lot of people, just I guess anecdotally, but I've also read a bit about this, people like moving out of cities and kind of more towards growing some of their own food or having a more substantial garden. And I think that's amazing.
It seems that over time, food has gone from being one of our sort of main focuses. We would have been focused on food and shelter, and kind of everything else was kind of secondary. In the West, at least, we have so much of it that it's, we can afford to kind of kind of concentrate on our work, but then food is a joy. It's a passion or a hobby. And how do you think that might change in the future, like with the next generation? What if you were to sort of predict?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and actually many governments, including Japan, Japanese government, are trying to answer that question, because there's in many areas that even in the US and I guess probably most countries, where the farmer and the food producing population is getting older and older, and it's hard to get younger people interested. So yeah, Japan has some ideas and plans around, and I'll just speak, I guess, not only Japan, but maybe globally, their kind of desires, to get people, more back to the land, and I think that's fantastic. It's not happening in Japan, for example, in the numbers that it kind of needs to happen in order to like revitalize rural agricultural areas, because most young people are just interested in moving to the bigger cities. So we have to look at interesting food production that can happen, in more urban environments as well. But yeah, there are programs, there are offices where you can kind of walk in and get information about moving to the more rural areas, prefectures. And I think they are paying some people to, yeah, to kind of to do that, to go populate these areas. Yeah, I want to go grow at least part of my food, or like, maybe know the farmer down the street from me and try to like people are interested in shortening supply chains. And I also think that's great. That's excellent. And there's like yeah.
I mean, that almost goes against the idea of kind of food tech, though, doesn't it? And the idea of going back to basics.
Yeah. Yeah, but there's no one answer, right? I mean, like what, like there it's not like this or that. I mean, if a few million or billion people go back to the land, and then there's a few million of the brightest minds working on food tech, those two can work beautifully in tandem, right? I mean, it doesn't need to be this like paired against like this kind of battle. I mean, I think the more we can improve the ingredients and the raw materials and the food and the packaging, coming to shelf, and ideally reduce carbon footprint and miles traveled, the better. And that will take people both getting back to the land and some probably pretty high-tech innovative ideas. So I think there's a bit of a place for multiple philosophies and skill sets within the new food transition.
Why do we need to change the way we eat?
Yeah, so I mean, as the population booms and simultaneously, societies transition to become wealthier, typically what's happening is they're eating more meat. And the agricultural land available globally, I believe around 70% of it is used to grow crops to feed to animals. So we're really not utilizing our available agricultural land in the smartest way possible. And no, that's not for example, like grass-fed beef or something. That's a different story, but that only makes up quite a small percentage of the meat that's actually being consumed. But yeah, mowing down acres of rainforest, or other viable land, or especially rainforest, is pretty awful situation, in order to harvest cows on that land, or grow crops in a monocropping way to meet the demand for meat globally, is yeah, we're gonna run out of space. And another piece of it is the public health piece around antibiotics. So we're feeding farm animals at least twice the amount, or potentially more, of the like antibiotics as are available to humans, and this could largely result in antibiotic resistance. And from what I understand, yeah, it's kind of could end up being a pretty bad situation
Right.
if
Yeah.
we don't have antibiotics available that are much needed for humans that we've given to farm animals, and then there have become some kind of resistant strains, zoonotic diseases coming from that.
If it's a race between sort of changing people's attitudes to the food they eat or changing the food they eat, which one of those do you think is more likely to?
The latter, for sure. Changing, I think, I believe, yeah, changing the food that they eat is just because I think the work should continue on changing attitudes and on consumer awareness and education. Absolutely should continue full steam ahead.
Yeah.
But we've kind of seen that it's yeah, and when I say we, just like in the food world and in the people who care about sustainable food systems, yeah, behavior change and changing what people consume day to day, it's quite difficult
Right.
to convince people or to change patterns. It takes like a pretty significant disruption in their life, or it can change over time, but it's not really, from a lot of the work that and research that's gone into it, it's not happening at a pace fast enough to align with, climate goals. And so, changing the mechanisms by which people are getting their food, kind of, I guess, a bit of a more top-down approach, or working within the systems that are in existence rather than trying to, completely dismantle them. But yeah, getting the food to people that they, for whatever reason, want to eat, it is probably going to be the more successful path. And not that that's easy or anything. I mean, that
Yeah.
has its own massive set of hurdles. To a certain extent, we have to work within what has become the human experiment and the way people operate, eat, commute, sleep, and then go about their
Yeah.
days. We can't just totally throw that on its head and imagine something completely new. The work of good journalism, good educators, and maybe in some instances, good, yeah, good policymakers or ethical business people, has gotten us to a point where now isn't World Economic Forum or Davos meeting happening like now, or
Yeah.
where I imagine every meeting or every other meeting, the like SDG goals or sustainability goals are at least going to be mentioned. And I'm not saying that there's not loads of, greenwashing happening. There is, but
Yeah.
it's at least on the global radar and on the industry radar at such a high level that, no business can afford to, or would imagine at this stage, not having some kind of sustainability initiative or people working full time on sustainable projects. So yeah, it's taken a long time and maybe too much time, but there has been progress made. And I think if we imagine the next 10, 15 years, as long as we don't all just get like crazy levels of climate fatigue or something, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that these meetings, these initiatives are going to continue to be pushed further and like baked into the, corporate strategy and things like that, hopefully.
Is your organization involved politically?
Yeah, so actually, GFI was one of the few organizations that was part of planning the food pavilion for COP27 in Egypt,
Okay.
and a big part of getting the product to the Eat Just, or the Good Meat is their cultivated meat arm,
Okay.
and getting the product there for policymakers to try and to have, higher level meetings and conversations about that. So yeah, there are definitely full-time policy focused team members on the GFI team, working in yeah, I think every country that we're operational in, there's at least one or a few members of those teams working on the policy side. So that's a big focus of, yeah, so both kind of research, policy recommendations, white papers, presenting those to policymakers, having these meetings. Like I was saying, in Japan, like regulatory science seems to be a pretty big need for the ministries here, as well as some of the companies. So we do talk to governments and kind of see where they stand, and see where there are opportunities to work together with them to build alternative proteins into their overall like food and sustainability strategies. So yeah, that's a big part of what GFI does.
Okay. And are you a vegetarian yourself, Chris?
So I was, yeah, I was, and I do consume far less meat, probably like once a week.
Okay.
I'm not currently, so even, yeah, I'm not.
Would you say
currently
you're
100% animal free in my diet? Yeah, it's
it
mostly
sounds like
cheese.
it sounds like you're a little bit like me. I have been vegetarian a number of times over my life, but now I'm just sort of a bit more. I am a flexitarian. I think is the term, which I suppose is who this new technology is aimed at. I'm talking about sort of cultured meat. It's like I love the taste of meat, and it's very hard to sort of give it up. But I would like to sort of eat meat guilt free.
Yeah, some people say there's no benefit to eating animal meat. Other people say there is benefit to. So if cultivated meat, comes into the picture, ideally it would be done in a way that delivers, health benefits that one might expect from eating animal meat as well. And that's certainly a part of the like R&D that's going on within it. So yeah, for sure, there's nothing more I'd love than, and it might be the reality in 5-10 years, is buying something that's either, I went to the grocery store today and bought a few plant-based products here in Japan that are kind of like meat analogs. And I would love to have the option to buy something that's maybe like, cultivated meat at a decent price in the coming years.
It seems certain to me, at least, that we can agree change is definitely coming. The future of food is probably going to look very different to what it looks like today. Thank you, Chris. That's all we have time for, I'm afraid. I thought it'd be good to finish by listening to some more words from your boss at the Good Food Institute. That leaves me nothing else to say but to thank Roy Smith for the music, and thank you very much for listening.
As somebody who spent the last 2 decades advocating a shift away from industrial meat production, I wanted to believe that this clarion call was going to make a difference. The thing is, I've seen this sort of thing again and again and again for decades. The main point of these studies tends to be climate change, but antibiotic resistance represents just as big of a threat. We are feeding massive doses of antibiotics to farm animals. These antibiotics are then mutating into superbugs that threaten to render antibiotics obsolete within all of our lifetimes. You want to scare? Google the end of working antibiotics. I'm going to get one thing out of the way. I am not here to tell anybody what to eat. Individual action is great, but antibiotic resistance and climate change, they require more. Besides, convincing the world to eat less meat hasn't worked. For 50 years, environmentalists, global health experts, and animal activists have been begging the public to eat less meat. And yet per capita meat consumption is as high as it's been in recorded history. The average North American last year ate more than 200 pounds of meat, and I didn't eat any, which means somebody out there ate 400 pounds of meat. On our current trajectory, we're going to need to be producing 70 to 100% more meat by 2050. This requires a global solution. What we need to do is we need to produce the meat that people love, but we need to produce it in a whole new way. I've got a couple of ideas. Idea number 1, let's grow meat from plants. Instead of growing plants, feeding them to animals, and all of that inefficiency, let's grow those plants, let's biomimic meat with them. Let's make plant-based meat. Idea number 2, for actual animal meat, let's grow it directly from cells. Instead of growing live animals, let's grow the cells directly. It takes 6 weeks to grow a chicken to slaughter weight. Grow the cells directly, you can get that same growth in 6 days. It's your friendly neighborhood meat brewery. I want to make 2 points about this. The first one is we believe we can do it. In recent years, some companies have been producing meat from plants that consumers cannot distinguish from actual animal meat. And there are now dozens of companies growing actual animal meat directly from cells. This plant-based and cell-based meat gives consumers everything that they love about meat, the taste, the texture, and so on, but with no need for antibiotics and with a fraction of the adverse impact on the climate. And because these two technologies are so much more efficient, at production scale, these products will be cheaper. But one quick point about that, it's not going to be easy